right, it looks like we are live. I would like to welcome everyone to this meeting. It is a special City Council meeting workshop on municipal finance. And it is May 10th at now 5:32. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Clerk, please call the roll.
Certainly. Councilmember Altman.
Here.
Councilmember Wright.
Here.
And Mayor Greeno.
I am here. And when, if any of the other council members join, please just take notice of when they join and let the record reflect that, please. At this time, let's stand and pledge allegiance to our flag. Oh, it looks like Mayor Pro Tem is here now. So, ready and begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. At this time, we will move on to public comment. Any member of the audience is invited to address the City Council on any matter that is within the jurisdiction of the City of Crescent City. Comments of public interest or on matters appearing on our agenda are accepted. Note, however, that the council is not able to undertake extended discussion or act on non-agendized items. Such items can be referred to staff for appropriate action, which may include placement on a future agenda. All comments shall be directed towards the entire council. Any comments that are not at the microphone are out of order and will not be part of the public record. After receiving recognition from the mayor, please state your name and city or county residency for the record. Public comments will be limited to 3 minutes. The public is additionally allotted 3 minutes for each agendized item. If you would like to drop us an email, we do have an email line, publiccomment@crescentcity.com or .org, should I say. And then if you'd like to phone in your public comment, you can phone it in at 253-215-8782 with the webinar ID 864-6010-0922. Or if you're joining us on Zoom, you can just raise your hand. Do we have any public comment at this time?
Not have any public comment on the Zoom side of things.
And there have been no emails received.
All right, thank you very much. At this time, we're going to move on to the one item on our agenda, which is the Municipal Financing Bond 101 from Urban Futures.
All right, thank you, Mayor Greeno, members of the council. So with us tonight, we have our municipal financial advisors, Urban Futures. And with that, we have Wing C. Fox and we have Brandon Kafori with us. They're going to be walking you through what it means for a municipality to basically to borrow funds and some of the different options that we have before us as a city. The council authorized us to hire Urban Futures for the Johnson Control Project, and then also authorized an amendment to their contract to do just this, to help us with some of the financial planning aspects and looking at some of those opportunities that we have before us as a city. Some of the projects that you need to be thinking about, or that we will be thinking about as a community as we go forward, include projects in the general fund, like improvements to our police station that we talked about with the Measure S committee, improvements to Front Street. Again, we've talked about that with the Measure S committee, and in regard to possible, portions that could be funded with a grant, and then other portions that might have to be a match, but it could be a match that maybe is too large for the city just to fund out of the general fund. We have City Hall that has been a priority for the council in this community and the options to fund that. Then we have our Johnson Controls project, which we'll be bringing back to the council at a future meeting, which might have some sort of debt service piece to it. So we have several projects in the general fund that will be in front of this council at some point in time. And then there are the enterprise funds or the utilities, which have somewhat of a separate set of rules that they play by to a certain extent. And Wing C and Brandon will be able to talk about that. But those projects in those funds include, a transmission main replacement or redundant main that runs along Kings Valley that we've talked about in the past, meter replacements, and just key projects that are really important for us as a city to make sure that our infrastructure is up and running. This is also the same with the wastewater treatment plant and the enterprise fund that really that sewer enterprise is. And then how do we go about trying to implement some of those critical projects that are beyond our financial capabilities? And then the last piece that will need to be sort of weighing in as a city is some of the other opportunities that we're trying to take advantage of. And that's some of the grants that are out there. So we applied for the Beachfront Park Master Plan. That's $8.5 million, zero match. Doesn't mean that we don't have to have the cash flow to keep up with the reimbursements. So it's going to be a large construction project in which we will get reimbursed. But how do we handle that short term where we might have to pay a contractor maybe $2 million before we get reimbursed? So there's going to be some of those decisions. They can talk briefly about those opportunities. Pebble Beach project, it's 97% funded, but it again falls in that same realm where we need to not only be thinking about the fact that we're going to get reimbursed, but it's that timing and that process for when we get reimbursed. So as they sort of dive into it, those are some of the projects that this really has that direct connection to that I'd like the council to be thinking about. And then as they get towards the end of the project, they'll actually be looking at some of the basic numbers that and impacts that this could have. So with that, I'll turn it over to Wing C and to Brandon.
Thank you, Eric. Good evening, Mayor, members of the City Council. As Eric mentioned, my name is Wing C, and with me is my colleague, Brandon. So Brandon is going to share his screen. We have a short presentation. Can everybody see that?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So just to start off, a quick commercial. We'd be remiss if we didn't give you a quick commercial just to let you know about our firm. Go ahead, next slide. So we are a firm that has 3 different groups, 2 of which are currently working with the City of Crescent City. So Public Finance Group, which is the traditional municipal advisory licensed work around debt and borrowing. Public Management Group, we provide some long-term financial forecasting, looking at pension and OPEB, prepayments and how to manage the UAL, as well as some specific studies and strategic planning. We also have an Analytics and Compliance Group that offers continuing disclosure, arbitrage rebate. Really, these are post-issuance compliance services after an issuer has issued debt. So as far as our Public Finance Group is concerned, we work with all different types of credits, as Eric touched on. You can issue general obligation credit, general fund, pension obligation bonds have come back into full swing, tax allocation bonds, land secured, and enterprise type bonds. We work with a lot of issuers, but we specifically focus in on California. And in terms of the number of deals completed, we do more deals than any other firm in California. Here are just a few examples of clients that we've worked on various types of transactions like the ones that the city is looking at and considering right now. So just a very high level overview of municipal bonds, and funding capital projects with municipal bonds. One of the benefits of issuing debt for capital projects is that right now, and we'll get into this a little bit more, we are still near all-time historically low interest rates, even though we're not at the very, very low. So it's a good time to lock in long-term rates at a very low level. Borrowing also allows issuers to accelerate priority projects. So instead of on a pay-go basis, where sometimes by the time you've kind of collected money along the way and made improvements and you're done with improvements, you're all the way back at the beginning of, say, the street and making improvements again because of the time that it takes to build up that capital. So funding and financing allows you to accelerate those types of projects and still spread the cost over time. And spreading the cost over time also has a generational equity component where if you're building a facility or infrastructure that has a useful life of say 30 years, you're really spreading the cost of that infrastructure or facility to the ratepayers and taxpayers that will benefit from it from future generations, instead of just charging current users and taxpayers for that facility. It also allows issuers to free up reserves and one-time monies and cash to, for example, redirect towards pension and OPEB liabilities. With pension, an unfunded accrued liability accruing at a 7%. So, you can borrow at a tax exempt rate at say 3% and use pay-go money or reserves to make payments on your higher credit card debt of 7%. And financing proceeds are used for infrastructure projects that Eric touched upon at the beginning of the meeting. They're used for solar energy efficiency improvements, water, wastewater. Also, as I mentioned lately, to fund and pay down pension obligations. And we will touch on also financing for operating capital, really for cash flow needs. So what drives the borrowing cost? I mentioned that interest rates are still near historic lows, even though they've creeped up in the last few months. They did reach all-time lows earlier, late last year. And so interest rates as a backdrop definitely influences the municipal bond market. What the Fed is saying definitely influences the municipal bond market. But as far as municipal bonds are concerned, the supply and demand dynamic is really what drives, at the day of pricing, what we really look at in terms of the technicals. So in terms of supply, how many bonds are you bond issuances are you competing with that day, that week that you're coming to market? In terms of demand, how much money is coming in to bond funds, so that bond funds have to put the money to work and they want to buy municipal bonds when they have the funds available. So we look at inflows into bond funds, as well as when you come to the market, how many other issuers are you competing with? So this slide shows, again, just mentioned a couple times already, that we're still near historical lows. The top left graph shows the 5-year, 10-year, and 30-year municipal market data, MMD. This is a market index for tax-exempt municipal bonds. So it's the benchmark that we use to price against for tax-exempt bonds. And so the city of Crescent City, for example, would price at a spread to MMD. So if you can see since 2000, it's generally trended down. And then on the lower right-hand side, you see the MMD range since January 2008. So since January 2008, rates for the 1 year all the way through the 30-year municipal bond is ranged in the blue bars. And then the green line is where we're currently at. So that just gives you a scale and perspective of, yeah, we're still near historic lows at this point, all the way along the curve. So there's generally two main types of sales that an issuer engages in. It's public offering and private placement. A public offering is, more traditional, going out to multiple investors on a given pricing day. So the issuer hires an underwriter who pre-markets the sale, and then the day that we fix to price, they take orders on those bonds. And generally these bonds are serialized, which means you sell bonds at a 1-year rate, a 2-year, a 3-year, all the way to say a 30-year. And the underwriter is taking orders for all of those bonds. This is unique in the sense that you can borrow 30 years. So it's for longer term financings. The investor market is very accepting of 30-year borrowing. And as I'll go over on the private placement market, typically only have about 1 or 2 financial institutions that will go out that long. So for capital projects that you want to amortize over 30 years, this is a great method of sale. You also tend to have lower interest rates because, as I mentioned, you're selling 1-year bonds for at a lower rate, and it goes all the way up the curve to 30 years. So really taking advantage of that yield curve. And also better when you have larger borrowings because you get more interest. If you're competing against other really large bond issuances the same day or the same week, harder to get investor attention unless you've got a larger size borrowing. In either case, for public or private, the financing does have to go to council and get authorization with not to exceed parameters from the council before proceeding. The public offering as opposed to a private placement. And this is more typical of going to a qualified investor or financial institution or a bank and directly placing a loan or the securities with that bank with the intention of that bank holding that loan or municipal security. And as I mentioned before, these banks will go out no longer than 20 years. Typically, you get more interest if it's 15 years. And then there's one or two or a handful that will go out 25 or 30 years. But really the sweet spot for this type of method of sale is the 15-year range. And if you have a smaller borrowing, this tends to be more efficient. There's lower cost of issuance, but the interest rate does tend to be higher because you typically place this as a term loan. So you don't have that advantage of the public offering, taking advantage of that yield curve. You're placing, say, a 15-year loan at one single rate with this financial institution. The advantages of the private placement is that you can usually get to closing the financing quicker, maybe 4 weeks, maybe a little bit more quicker than a public offering, because you don't need to draft a preliminary official statement or official statement, which is that offering document. You don't need to go to the rating agency and get a rating. And so it saves on staff time. Also, continuing disclosure tends to be not as burdensome as in the public market. This slide gives you a sense of the team members that are involved. Sometimes issuers are surprised at the number of team members it takes to get a financing through to closing, but it really does take bond counsel, which would also be a fiduciary of the city, to opine on the validity of the bonds, to give an opinion on the tax exempt status of their tax exempt bonds, and to draft all the legal documents. If it's a public offering, then you also have a disclosure counsel, which can often be the same firm as the bond counsel. They draft that offering document and also provide some important securities training for staff and council members. You also have a trustee or fiscal agent. More often in the public offering market, they basically they make the bond payments, they represent the bondholders, and hold funds in trust. And then the rating agency, as I mentioned, only for public offering required rating. And then the top two include the municipal advisor, which, as I've described, is our role in terms of performing the fiduciary duties and duty of loyalty to our clients. We're really here to quarterback the transaction, make sure that we develop the schedule, make sure that the team members are performing to that schedule. And also when working with the underwriter, we have experience in looking at the comparables that they pull when it comes to pricing, and generally making sure that the pricing seems fair at the time and in the market that the deal is going to sale. So regardless of public offering or private placement, you're going to have the municipal advisor and the underwriter either serves as the underwriter or the placement agent, as well as the bond counsel. This is a sample financing schedule, more geared towards the public offering, because you see in there's the rating agency and getting the rating before you issue the bonds. But again, there is the meeting that we will come back to council with any financing, and that will have the final form of documents, including all the legal documents that the bond counsel drafts. If it's a public offering, the offering document, the disclosure counsel drafts, and a resolution that describes all the not to exceed parameters of the bond issuance, as well as good faith estimates of what the financing will cost at the time of the council approval meeting. So all told, about 4 months. Again, with a private placement can be about 3 months, depending on how long it takes on the front end in terms of issuing RFPs for bond and disclosure councils and for the underwriter. And with that, I'm just going to stop there and see if there's any questions. Kind of again, a very quick high-level overview of the municipal bond market and what's involved in issuing bonds.
All right. Do we have any questions from the council at this time so far? Okay. Do we have any questions from the public? Do we have public comment at this time?
Don't see any hands raised at this point, Mayor.
Okay.
Okay, great. Well, with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brandon, who's going to talk a little bit more about the credit rating process and the different types of bond issuance. And then we'll come back and talk a little bit more specific about Crescent City.
Great. Thank you, Winksy, and good evening, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. On slide 16, as Winksy mentioned, should the city want to proceed with a public sale of debt, a credit rating would need to be obtained. For this process, we would go to a rating agency, which analyzes the credit quality of bonds and assigns a rating. In today's market, there are 4 rating agencies: Standard & Poor's, Moody's, Fitch, and Kroll. More often than not, we work with S&P for city bond issuances, as they, in our experience, are most familiar with these types of credits. The purpose of the rating is to assess an issuer's ability to make payments through maturity. And the rating would be obtained prior to going to market. So in terms of how this would be sequenced, we would, in the case of a public sale, look to post a preliminary official statement to the market, and we would obtain a rating prior to that and meet with a rating agency in advance and provide them documents to complete their review. Once the rating is obtained, it's continuously reviewed to help investors determine the value, and the rating could change over time depending on how the credit quality changes. This slide just gives you an overview of the scale that's used by the agencies. As you can see, the highest rating is AAA. Anything above that line on the bottom, above a double B, or in the case of Moody's, a BA, is a investment grade rating. And the key takeaway here is that the higher the rating, typically the lower the yield or the interest rate that an issuer would pay, and vice versa. So a below investment grade rating would typically result in a higher yield bond issue. This gives you a sort of an overview of the different credit sectors and how credit quality is perceived for each type of credit, ranging from GO bonds, which are typically the highest credit quality, as they are secured by an unlimited pledge of property tax revenues. This is typically the lowest interest rate or lowest yielding bonds that are issued. Enterprise revenue bonds are also favorably viewed and well regarded by investors, given that they're backed by revenues of water, sewer, electric, utility revenues, which are typically essential service and are paid by customers. Next would be lease revenue bonds, which are backed by the general fund of the agency issuing them. And there's an appropriation process that would happen with those. Tax allocation bonds and land secured bonds are also on this chart. Land secured bonds are typically viewed as a lower credit quality, given that they are backed by special taxes within the district itself. And it's not necessarily the full faith and credit of the agency issuing the bonds. To drill down a little more on each of the types of credits, general obligation bonds or GO bonds, again, are annual tax levied on property tax roll in proportion to the total assessed property values. They require a 2/3 voter approval, or in the case of some school GOs, it's 55%. And voters would approve the total bond amount and use the proceeds. The advantage of this is that it generates a new revenue source to pay the debt. You would get a broad-based tax support for the public improvements. And as I mentioned, it's the lowest interest cost due to the ad valorem security and unlimited tax pledge. However, it generally takes more time to do one of these, and the election is, it's not guaranteed that you would get the desired outcome. And it would also result in a property tax increase. For general fund lease financings, these are leaseback structures with a third-party entity. The issuer would covenant to appropriate annual lease payments from the general fund, and these would be used to secure the payments on the debt. They can either be issued as lease revenue bonds or certificates of participation, and they're not subject to constitutional debt limits. There's no voter approval required, and it's a fairly quick financing process when you compare it to a GO, given the lack of voter approval required for this. In terms of the disadvantages, it does require the issuer to lease assets to support the debt. So, and those assets must be equal to or greater than the borrowing amount. In the case of the city of Crescent City, we've done a preliminary review of the insured values of the assets that would be, the city would be able to lease. And it does appear that there's sufficient value there to support all of the proposed debt issuance should the city desire to move forward. So there is some flexibility on that front. These types of borrowings are typically used for projects that have a general community benefit. They are used to indirectly leverage a general fund revenue stream, and they can also be used to provide a credit enhancement for less credit-worthy borrowing or for desired risk sharing. So, for instance, the city could issue on the general fund and do an inter-fund borrowing with another one of its funds, and use this mechanism for that. Lastly, I'll just mention enterprise revenue bonds. As I mentioned, are electric, water, and or sewer utility enterprises typically. These are secured by a net revenue pledge. So all fees and charges of the enterprise are, after the payment of operations and maintenance, are used to secure the bonds. The main covenant here is a rate covenant. So when you issue an enterprise revenue bond, the issuer commits to charge rates that are sufficient to pay the debt service with some cushion. So it's fairly common that for instance, you might see a 1.2 times or 1.25 times rate covenant on the debt, meaning you'd have to set rates such that net revenues are 125% of the debt service at minimum. These bonds are used by essential service utilities. They tend to be very well regarded by investors, as I mentioned, given that a water revenue pledge or sewer revenue pledge is backed by those direct revenues, which in theory are stable and paid by the customers of the system. Some disadvantages are that it's subject to Prop 218, and non-utility enterprises may be less creditworthy. But these are typically used when there are capital improvements related to an enterprise that need to be completed. On this slide, we drill down on S&P's analytical framework for local geo ratings or issuer credit ratings. So these would be the criteria used for a general obligation bond, as well as general fund backed debt, including lease revenue debt. And typically the way it works is that a GO bond gets a particular rating from S&P, and what they typically do is rate a lease revenue credit one notch lower than that rating due to the appropriation risk that they view on the lease. In both cases, for the general fund, there are mainly 7 criteria that S&P looks at. Those are all listed here. They're each weighted, and S&P would essentially go through each criteria, give the city a score, and then it's weighted through their formula to give a rating outcome. So I'll just briefly go through these. Institutional framework is 10%. They're going to look at your predictability of revenues, revenue and expenditure balance, which is your ability to finance projects, transparency of the organization, system support, which is your ability to get help and services and support in times of emergency or crises. Economic score is really the largest percentage. Here's 30%. S&P mainly looks at your effective buying income of your residents and the total market value per capita, which is basically assessed value over your population. Management score is 20%. They'll give an assessment of managerial decisions, policy choices, and other matters to give a score on that ranking. Budgetary flexibility and performance are each 10%. And rounding it out would be liquidity at 10% and debt and contingent liabilities, which also factors in your long-term debt and your pension and OPEB liability. So what we were able to do is do a preliminary analysis of the city of Crescent City's potential creditworthiness based on S&P's scale. And we incorporated your 2020 audit and factored in a proposed debt issuance for some of the proposed projects that we're going to talk about on the following slides. As you can see, based on the preliminary analysis, the indicative issuer credit rating for the city falls in the A+ range, inclusive of the proposed bond issuance. Therefore, a lease revenue bond issuance would be rated one notch lower in the A category. And so we've carried these assumptions forward, and I'll let Wing C talk about the subsequent slides where we had provided some preliminary analysis using this indicative rating. Wing C.
Thanks, Brandon.
Actually, Wing, can I maybe stop you just right there, just to sort of do a basic recap for your average person that maybe isn't quite as in depth or it lives in this world that you guys do on a day in, day out basis. So you kind of went over several different components, but in general, you're going to be talking about sort of that bond market, right, and kind of that public placement. And so in a summary of that, it's a lot of work to put it in place. There's a lot of resources that are required with underwriters and bond counsel and all those different things. But you can get longer terms, you can get lower rates. It's just people have to actually buy those bonds, and so it's a much more complicated, longer process. And then and stop me if I'm wrong. Right? This is just me summarizing. So if there's anything I'm not quite articulating right, please jump in. And then you have the private placement side of things, and we're talking fund here. And on the private placement, it's a much more streamlined process where it's basically a bank loan for the sort of the end user. Terms are lower in the amount of years, so it's a shortened financing. And sometimes you'll see, depending on the amount you borrow, those interest rates will be higher than your public placement. Correct?
That's right.
And then you
balanced out somewhat by cost of issuance on the private placement is a little bit lower than public offering, as well as less staff time.
Gotcha. And then on the enterprise side of things, the key thing there, and the council will see this if we talk about rates and kind of go through rate studies, that debt service coverage ratio, basically, right? I mean, you have to have the revenues from your rates need to be able to meet those requirements of basically borrowing that money for the most part. You have to have the rates to support it, and then you'll be able to go and borrow that money for the enterprise funds. A lot of times that will require some sort of a possibly rate increase depending on the size of the project, to also be looked at in regard to your normal operations, so that the bank that's letting you borrow those funds basically knows that you can pay those back. Is that a fair assessment?
That's right. And it provides some cushion to any fluctuations if your projections are slightly off or not realized as expected.
So that's where it's not a one-to-one where you're just barely able to pay your bills. They're looking for something slightly higher than that in case, the unexpected happens.
That's right.
Mayor, any questions from yourself or the council at this point?
I don't have any. Anyone on the council have any questions? All right.
Okay, we can see Brandon, all yours.
Thank you, Eric. That's a great summary. So just drilling down to more specifics with the contemplated projects for the city. We've categorized the general fund projects together that Eric mentioned at the beginning of the call, the Johnson Control energy efficiency projects at estimated cost currently at 1.4 million, the City Hall project 2.4 million, the Front Street project at 4 million, and the police facility at 1 million. And we think that the opportunity, even though the JCI projects were being evaluated so separately from City Hall, Front Street, and police facility, that to the extent that there are projects that are prioritized and expected to start construction around the same time, it would be more efficient to borrow for these projects at the same time rather than splitting them up and borrowing for JCI projects, for example, in 3 months and then 6 months later for the City Hall. You're going to save on staff time as well as cost of issuance. And the sooner you get to market, we're still again at near historical low rates, and the sooner you can lock in these low rates. I also wanted to caveat that, so these general fund projects, we have not contemplated the general obligation bond credit where you would have to go out to voters. This is, as Brandon mentioned, a lease-back type transaction where, say for City Hall, for that project, you would lease that City Hall. And so your debt service payments would be supported by lease payments that the city would be making to this counterparty. And the cost of that lease can be allocated to some of the enterprise funds. So to the extent, for example, the City Hall includes certain square footage that can be allocated to the water or sewer enterprise funds, like counters, accepting bills or customer service, then some of those lease payments, again, can be allocated to these enterprise funds. For a street project, you wouldn't lease a street. Leasing streets has done before, generally not a traditional leased asset. You would use, say, a rec center or a park or a police station as the leased asset to fund that type of project. And as Brendan mentioned, the industry standard is if you're going to borrow 8.8 million, then you're going to lease assets that have a value of at least 8.8 million. Because that's the standard for, okay, with that value, then my lease payments or my debt service payments really do represent what a market lease would be.
And so we just to sort of, give a real life example for Crescent City. So Front Street, say we wanted to borrow the $4 million for Front Street that we might need. And all these numbers are just to give the council sort of an idea. These don't represent, actual numbers. They're close to what we're talking about order of magnitude wise. But if we wanted to borrow the $4 million for Front Street, we would then need to have some sort of physical asset. So it'd be like, the swimming pool and fire hall or something that actually has that value in a building to borrow that money for a street project. Versus if you were to build City Hall with the Bank of America, the asset would be City Hall. Is that right?
Yes, with the caveat that if you're not, you can only start making lease payments when you're occupying City Hall. So let's say construction takes a year. In that 1 year, we would lease, say, the pool or a rec center in the park, and then release that asset, replace it with City Hall once you're actually occupying City Hall. And just to be clear, I know we say pledge. So these assets are not pledged to the investor like a typical home loan where you can actually foreclose. These assets are owned by the city and will always be owned by the city unless they decide to dispose of it. This security is really backed by the investor. If the city does not meet its lease payments, the trustee on behalf of the investor can come and re-lease or re-let or re-rent that facility to other leasees, and to make those lease payments. But if you're pledging City Hall, investors are very comfortable that the city is going to appropriate those lease payments and not just decide not to pay. So that's the concept again with these lease-back structures, very commonly used for general fund projects. And Brandon also talked about enterprise fund credits, which would be used, for example, for the water meter replacement project that JCI has presented. Preliminary, we're looking at a $2 million scenario and a $5 million scenario. Again, as Eric so eloquently summarized, secured by the net revenues of the water system. So going to the next slide. We did run some current market scenarios. If we were to issue debt for all of those general fund projects that we just looked at, it would be a total of 8.8 million. If it was just City Hall and the Johnson Control projects, that would be 3.8 million. So we looked at both scenarios. For the larger 8.8 million amount, we looked at public sale versus private placement, with the public sale going out 30 years, which results in lower annual debt service payments, but more interest overall, versus a private placement at the 20-year borrowing. And then also, again, that 3.8 million. And we assumed a private placement with such a small borrowing amount, probably more efficient to do as a private placement. We assume for the public offering that single A rating that Brandon talked about, and it is important to maintain a strong credit rating if you want to access the debt market, even in private placement, even though you're not getting an official rating, you want to maintain a strong credit to, again, retain that future access to the market. We assumed level debt service for all of these scenarios and a closing date in July. So the next slide shows we illustrate the different colors are the different projects for the general fund to give you a sense of, okay, all together 8.8 million in the top left graph. You're seeing about $440,000 in total debt service. But if you're just looking at the JCI energy efficiency projects, that's appropriate colored in green. And then the City Hall is the orange. The more expensive $4 million Front Street project is in gray, and then the police facility in blue. So you can get a sense of the proportion of debt service that each project would throw off. And again, top left is a public sale at 30 years. The bottom right is the private placement at 20 years. So you can see higher debt service payments of 620,000 in the private placement scenario because you're shortening the term, but you'll be paying less in interest overall. So I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions about the debt service structure or the projects.
Okay, I don't have any questions. Does anyone on the council have any further questions so far?
I also wanted to mention, Eric brought up the Pebble Beach bank stabilization, as well as the beachfront park master plan improvements projects that are expected to be fully funded with grants, but may require some cash advances from the city. So just wanted to mention that there are options for cash flow borrowing within a fiscal year. It's a note that's, again, repaid within the fiscal year. There's also structures like grant anticipation notes, again, shorter borrowing that's anticipated to be repaid by once you receive the grant. So there are those options out there, but again, You want to maintain a strong credits and strong demonstration of the ability to repay to access those options. Great. If there's no other questions, move on to the water fund, the water meter replacement project. City has received estimates anywhere from 2 to 5 million. So we ran both scenarios to give you a sense of what the annual debt service payment would be, depending on the borrowing amount. So for a $2 million project, again, level debt service, we assumed a private placement 20-year borrowing for both scenarios. For the $2 million project, be looking at an average annual debt service of about $144,000. And for $5 million borrowing, you'd be looking at an average annual debt service of about $344,000. The all-in TIC stands for all-in true interest cost, so your all-in borrowing cost for the scenarios. Any questions on the water fund borrowings?
No.
This just graphs out what the debt service would look like, similar to home mortgage with the P&I, with the interest component making up a larger portion of your total debt service payment in the beginning, and then towards the end paying off the principal. And that concludes our presentation. Last slide is just our required regulatory disclosures. And we'll take any questions.
All right. Thank you so much for your presentation. Any questions from the council or any comments? Councilmember Altman?
I was just wondering if I could get a copy of the presentation. That's all.
Yes, yeah, I believe I have the final, and so we can see. And Brenda, if you are okay with it, I can send it to the council.
Yes, we can send it to you in PDF so that it's not as large of a file.
Excellent.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
You know, and a lot of this is just sort of food for thought as to how the process works. You know, there's still going to be that decision that just because we can doesn't necessarily mean we should, as a city, you know, borrow this. But this is a unique time where we are still at that bottom of the curve. I think over the last couple of months, we're starting to see that curve go up as far as interest rates go. So that is something to be aware of. There are several projects that I know that were important to the council, and even, you know, in regard to Measure S. So like the police department and that facility improvement. In that 5-year plan that we showed to the Measure S committee and the council, it had a certain debt service requirement. Now the terms were slightly different than what you saw tonight, but nonetheless, there was a certain debt service. I think it was $60,000 a year. Given these terms, 20-year term, higher interest rate, you know, that number would need to go up slightly. But, you know, using debt service to accomplish some of these facility needs is something the council, you know, should consider. And as we come back, as far as this next year's budget goes, there will be some options for the council to do just that, to maybe take that step forward with the police department, which might start with the design, maybe take that next step forward in regard to City Hall, which might be, again, starting with the design, sort of maybe a design build type of approach. You know, and then you have the other considerations that could tie up funding. And when we talk about the Johnson Control projects, you know, that again does somewhat tie up some of our ability to do these projects and to take out the proper financing to actually complete them. So as we bring that project back, that will be something we have to weigh. On the water side of things, you know, making sure that we have the debt service coverage, understanding how we're going to borrow that money is going to be important when we look at water meters, when we look at main replacements. So those are the main sort of points from tonight's meeting that I really wanted the council to hear from directly from Urban Futures and be able to ask any questions or just try to absorb some of that information. And then as we move forward, if there are future questions, that's the nice thing. We do have Urban Futures, you know, under contract to assist us and have a further discussion about this.
All right.
Mayor, if I could, I guess my takeaway is been, we've sort of been given a briefing of how it can be done. And then the second part is, can we do it? But really the most important question is, should we? And ultimately, that's what we need the expertise. How it's done, again, you guys are masters at doing all this and all these numbers and everything else. And are we in a position that we could? That's another question that looking at our finances and our audit that you guys can help us with. But I think the real critical question is, should we? And it has to go beyond, in my opinion, it has to go beyond our desires to accomplish projects. It has to go beyond maybe our dreams. Some of us have been around long enough to say, hey, we really wanted to see this done, and we're years into it, and we're still not seeing it done. But being able to make that decision to say we should needs to be tied to true fiscal responsibility that says we've evaluated where you stand, and in good faith we can advise you that this is your risk tolerance when it comes to debt service. And that's really what I'm going to have to look for, is what is that? What is that? Is it, we've seen options, right? If we look at the total thing, can we do 400 and some odd $1,000? Can we do 628? Can we even do 300 when it comes to water meters? And I think that those are questions that we really need to be able to answer, and then try to figure out if we're going to have a debt service, and I think we will of some sort, then where really are our priorities? Because I think that after seeing all this, at least from my perspective, it's pretty clear we can't do it all. We can't do it all. There's no way we can do it all, but clearly we can do something. So that's just I'm not asking for that tonight, but I think that's what I'm going to need as a policymaker, is a recommendation that says you need to stay in these parameters based on where you are financially as a city moving forward. The Johnson control piece is clearly an important piece, because it comes with a financing component already in it and a debt service. And since I have the longest history, I have the longest history with Johnson Controls even before Mr. Weir. I guess I just want to say, while I'm supportive of that approach, I'm not locked into that. I've never been locked into that. We need to make decisions that are going to be in the best interest of the long-term future of the city. If that works out to be Johnson Controls, then I'm all for that. If it doesn't, and we need to look at it from a different strategy of debt service, then I'm supportive of that as well. So thank you so much for your presentation. Very, very helpful to see all of this. I'd love to tell you that I understood everything you said, but I'd be lying if I did, so I won't. But that's why we have you under contract, to help guys like me make good decisions. So thank you so much, Wingsy, Brandon. I really appreciate it very much. Thank you, Mayor.
All right, thank you.
Very
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to say, this kind of gives us a baseline of where we're at, as well as it gives us the just an idea of where we can go with debt service. And you have to have a baseline. You have to have a starting point in order to know what your options are for the future. So I want to thank you both for your presentation tonight. And I don't know if we're going to go with any of this, but as a council, this gives us more options. So thank you so much.
Wing, did you want to add to that a little bit?
Yes, if I may, Mayor Pro Tem, I really, really appreciate your comments. And apologize if if there was ways that we can try to make some of the explanations more digestible. We're certainly happy to take that feedback. Gary did a great job. He's right. We do live and breathe this stuff. So we're municipal bond nerds over here. But I think you were spot on. And, you know, we wanted to go through the different type of credits because as you can kind of get a sense, when we're looking at enterprise bonds, it's really easy to give you the answer that you're looking for, right? Because you've got an enterprise fund that's really, it's isolated. It's only for water projects. You're getting water customer revenues. You're spending on water projects, and whether on an operating basis or a capital basis, you're backing into rates that cover all your revenue requirements, right? And so I can tell you, say, based on your financial, your CAFR from 2020, you've got about $830,000 that you have left over after you've paid O&M, right? You've got your revenues, you pay O&M. We always add back depreciation for debt service coverage. You can add your interest income. So that gives you a sense. If you have $800,000, you know, you want to have a decent amount of capital reserve and operating reserve. But if we're looking at a debt service that we had ran for a $2 million project, that's about $144,000 or $344,000 for a $5 million project. And so you can get a sense of, okay, we can afford that. Or if we really needed some type of capital improvement, that's going into our next rate study. We need to be able to charge rates that can cover everything. So a much easier question to answer on that side than on the general fund side. Because in the general fund side, you know, if we're not looking at geo debt that requires voter approval, it does come down to prioritization, as you had mentioned. And so we can give you a sense of, okay, we evaluated what we think about your credit is. And so we, you know, current market, this is what your borrowing costs would be. The stronger your credit rating, the lower your borrowing cost. The lower your credit rating, the higher borrowing cost. And so we're kind of giving you a sense of where we think you are, what the rating might be, and if you were to look at an 8.8 million versus 3.8 million, what that debt service would look like. And then it really does come down to priorities because, you know, you still have your pension payments that you're making. If you want to hire, you know, for Measure S, more positions, that's an ongoing cost that you're looking at. So, and that all hits the general fund. So you're spot on. It comes down to prioritization, and any way we can help to sort of clarify the picture from a borrower's perspective, we're happy to do so.
No,
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
And I definitely appreciate that wing. And Mayor Pro Tem too. I asked Linda to start her video because obviously, you know, the city's finance world revolves around Ms. Lever. She does a great job, and we're right in the throes of budget right now. And so what we intend to bring back to the council at our budget workshop is basically a look at what it takes to operate the city on a year in, year out basis and what those expenses are. These projects that we're talking about, they're going to come with a debt service. And so we can't look at them as one-time costs because we don't have that money. We're going to have that additional revenue to pay for these each and every year. So it's got to be those ongoing revenues have to be in excess of what our typical operations are. And then there's going to be this range in that's what we're shooting for anyway, to bring back to the council where they can pick and choose what those priorities are for that ongoing debt service. And then, you know, knowing like what Wing C said, as far as our credit rating and different things, we can kind of gauge on what that debt service might be. And then it's going to come down to the council thinking about those priorities, not just about today, but really about tomorrow, because this council is going to be making, if you choose to do a debt service for 20 years, right? That's a decision that this community will be paying for the next 20 years, and will be benefiting from whatever that improvement is. You know, if it's a new police department, or, you know, an upgraded police department to meet the needs of the community, if it's, you know, a new city hall, those are things we get now, but we pay for years. And so wanted Linda to pop on to make sure that she had anything to, you know, to add or any other thoughts, but certainly don't want to put her on the spot more than that.
No, I think you explained it really well. We, as you know, we're having our budget workshop in 2 weeks. And we will be presenting a proposed budget to the council with sort of the ongoing revenues and expenses and then the one-time revenues and expenses, with the goal of showing that the ongoing revenues are X amount above the ongoing expenses. And that's kind of what you have to sort of play with. And the options are, debt service or extra pension payments or other one-time projects. So that's what we'll be discussing in a couple weeks.
Excellent.
I just wanted to give Wing C and Brandon the same thing I always give you, Linda, and that is, so is this going to be okay if we do this? So, thank you.
All right. If there isn't any further discussion or any questions, I will open up public comment for one more time before we go to close. So any public comment?
Don't see any hands raised from our Zoom audience, Mayor.
And I've not received any emails.
Thank you. And I'll give one more whack at it from the council. Any more comments or questions?
Just thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Really do.
A pleasure.
I would like to echo the Mayor Pro Tem. Thank you so much for your presentation. I think it was very complete, and it gave us a good picture of what our options are when it comes to debt service and taking on bonds and whatnot. So with that, I will adjourn this meeting to our next city council meeting. It's going to be on the 17th at 6 o'clock. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening.
Night.
Night.
You.
Thank you.